Part 2, Shaping Medieval Europe on a Path to the Modern World. 2. Black Death sweating under his woolen robes. Pope Clement VI struggled to read the letter. Perhaps he should have known better than to open such missives in person. The bearer was an emissary from the Sultan of Egypt, and its contents detailed not only the coming of a great horde of infidels, but also their progress through Asia Minor, sacking cities and smiting Christians along the way. And that's when it hit him, the full force of what this meant. The Muslim forces were heading for Rome. Then again, so had many others over the centuries, and most had been repulsed or negotiated with. But there was something about the tone of this letter, a certain swagger in the messenger's bearing, which told the Pope that this time would be different. As the 1340s turned into the 1350s, Europe would face its greatest crisis since the Viking raids. The immediate trigger was the siege of the Byzantine city of Thessalonica, where in 1346 a small band of Genoese merchants who traded there found themselves trapped by the invading Ottomans. The Muslims were led by Prince Orhan, second only to the Sultan himself, and they soon overwhelmed the city's defences. As he laid siege, however, Orhan received word that the Genoese had called on Venice for help, and in response he decided to draw out the attack, slowly tightening his grip on the city. He knew that unless he could take it in one swift stroke, the Venetians would arrive and turn the siege into a costly affair. By now, the merchants had retreated to the safety of the fortified harbour area, which also contained several monasteries and the Archbishop's palace. This was to become the main point of resistance, and here the defenders held out for 9 months until finally Orhan launched his final assault. The Genoese counterattacked, opening a breach in the walls and forcing Orhan to withdraw. But the following day, they too ran out of ammunition and the city fell. Orhan didn't take prisoners, but among those he allowed to go free were 2 men who would play key roles in what happened next. One was Italian missionary Giovanni da Montecorvino, who would eventually make his way to the court of the Ming Emperor in China and write glowing accounts of his travels. The other was an unnamed Genoese soldier who would later be captured by the Turks and sold into slavery. But before that he witnessed firsthand the might of the Ottoman army, which he described in a letter home. Their number was enormous, and their infantry were all men of mark, tall, well-proportioned and well-built. Every man carried a fine sword at his side and a dagger at his girdle. Their discipline was excellent. They marched in ranks and files and did everything in a military manner. Indeed, Orhan's disciplined tactics and artillery skills proved decisive in the fall of Thessaloniki. And with the city's fall, the road to Constantinople was wide open. But while the Genoese soldiers' letter remained largely unknown in the West, news of the fall of Thessaloniki reached Paris in a sensationalized form. There it caught the attention of Jean Fauvart, chronicler of France and author of a popular history book. Fauvart took the story and wove it together with tales of earlier Mongol invasions, and created a thrilling narrative of Asiatic hordes descending on Europe, carrying off prisoners and booty. It was a colourful tale, spiced up with references to poisoned wells, catapults hurling burning pitchforks, and a sea of mounted horsemen engulfing the countryside. While historically inaccurate, his work fit neatly into a long-running tradition of stories about threatening outsiders, which served to bolster national unity against perceived internal and external threats. Thus, despite being thousands of miles away, the Genoese soldier's eyewitness account helped set the stage for the Black Death, a catastrophe which would have a profound impact on European society and prefigure the continent's path toward modernity. 1941. Warfare and State. Over the course of the 14th century, Europe's population grew dramatically. The climate was unusually warm and wet, leading to bumper harvests and rapid urbanization. By 1348, perhaps 25 million people crowded onto the continent, double the number just 2 centuries earlier. This sudden growth presented immense challenges. Cities struggled to house everyone, and disease spread rapidly. And then came the Black Death, which arrived in Sicily on trading ships from Asia in 1347. Carried by fleas living on rats, the bubonic plague caused painful swellings, fever, vomiting, and almost always death. Some victims survived, but suffered lifelong disabilities as a result. Within a year, it had killed 25% of the population of Sicily and then spread to the rest of southern Italy, followed by central Italy, France, Germany, and England. Entire communities were wiped out, and survivors fled to the countryside, abandoning their homes and possessions behind. Even worse, authorities had no idea how to stop it. Bloodletting, leeching, and the application of leeches were tried as treatments, as were purgatives like opium and a powder made of the aforementioned foxglove plant. None worked, and these practices may have actually made things worse. In all, the plague would kill an estimated 75 to 200 million Europeans over the course of the next few decades. So when you think of the Black Death, it's easy to think of it as a singular event. But in reality, it consisted of multiple waves of infection that ebbed and flowed across Europe for years. And with each wave, more and more people developed immunity. Thus, although it devastated Europe, the plague gradually lost lethality as the century wore on. That left the survivors facing the daunting task of rebuilding. The shortage of labor caused wages to rise. Survivors were reluctant to return to cities, and monarchs like Edward III of England tried to impose wage controls. But these efforts failed, and society began to change. In the past, most peasants had been tied to the land and obligated to live and work where their lords allowed them. But now, with labor shortages, they had leverage and began to demand greater freedom of movement. Some even purchased land. At the same time, trade revived quickly after the plague, thanks in part to new technologies that increased shipping capacity. With the growth of trade came the growth of towns, and with the growth of towns came the need for defense. So during the latter half of the 14th century, many English towns acquired town walls. But while the Black Death transformed society, it wasn't the only force reshaping Europe. To the east, the armies of the Ottoman Empire continued their advance. 2119, the way ahead. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the crusading zeal in Western Europe briefly flared up. But the subsequent collapse of the Byzantine Empire encouraged a more pragmatic approach to dealing with the Ottomans. Over the next century, European leaders concluded a series of accommodationist treaties with the Ottomans aimed at restoring trade relations and maintaining peace. But that changed in 1532 when the Holy League formed. Comprised of the Habsburg Charles V, Pope Paul III, and the Republic of Venice, the Holy League went to war with the Ottoman Empire in 1537, attempting to capture the strategically important island of Rhodes. Rhodes was fiercely defended by the Knights of St. John, a holy order founded in 1518 to take over the defense of the Holy Land after the fall of Jerusalem in 1291. But after being besieged for almost a year, they surrendered in 1522. The Ottomans now controlled the eastern Mediterranean and dominated trade between Europe and Asia. This arrangement benefited the Turks, but it was anathema to European powers seeking direct access to the riches of the East. By this point, the Portuguese had rounded Africa and established a sea route to Asia. But control of the Mediterranean was crucial for overland trade, and many merchants preferred to ship their goods through the Mediterranean rather than risk the perils of the Atlantic. Moreover, the Ottoman navy was growing rapidly and challenged the Portuguese monopoly on the seas. This threat encouraged cooperation between European rivals. In 1571, representatives of Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Republic of Venice, and the Papal States met in Venice and formed the Holy League to fight back. The Ottomans were defeated at the Battle of Lepanto, although neither side achieved a decisive victory. But by this point, the balance of power was shifting, and the old order was broken. The Catholic monarchs of Spain and Portugal had successfully completed the Reconquista in 1492, defeating the Moors and uniting the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule. Then, with the discovery of the New World, the Spanish Habsburgs became the dominant power in Europe, controlling vast territories in the Americas and the Philippines. Meanwhile, France emerged as a major naval power, aided by the introduction of new gunpowder weapons. The French king at the time, Henry IV, oversaw the construction of the first true battleship, La Galleon, in 1565. And England experienced a dramatic increase in trade during the reign of Elizabeth I. Thanks to the establishment of the English East India Company in 1600, England gained considerable wealth and power. And as the Dutch Republic matured in the late 16th century, it developed into a major naval player, challenging both England and Spain. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, the map of power in Europe looked radically different from the one that had prevailed in the wake of the Black Death. Gone was the dominance of France and England. In their place were Spain, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, Denmark, and Sweden. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire continued to grow, and the Russian Tsardom had emerged, and with these changes in power came changes in politics and warfare. The concept of sovereignty was increasingly being applied to the territorial states of Europe, which meant rulers were beginning to feel compelled to justify their right to rule. Kingship was no longer seen as God-given, but rather as a contract between the monarch and his subjects, and alongside this development came the nation-state. Monarchies used appeals to nationalism to garner support for their policies, helping transform formerly disparate groups of people into cohesive political units. And in order to protect their new states, European powers maintained standing armies, professional soldiers who fought for a salary rather than out of obligation. This transformation is evident in the Italian condottieri, mercenary armies that operated as private businesses. Led by powerful nobles, these armies were often employed by rival Italian states, and perhaps the most famous condottiero was the French mercenary Cesare Borgia. Although ruthless and controversial, his military genius was undeniable. A skilled engineer, he built roads, introduced accounting rules, and trained troops in advanced military tactics. By the mid-16th century, then Europe had entered what historians call the early modern period. Its characteristics included the emergence of centralized states, standing armies, economic and maritime expansion, and the increasing importance of religion as a political force. Yet many features of medieval life persisted, including the prevalence of rural life, the persistence of feudalism, and the centrality of religion in daily life. And whether or not Europe would continue down the path of state-building, territorial expansion and religious conflict would depend on the actions of three young men, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Henry VIII.